always let them. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to dispatch and the first working group of the week. If you're here for something other than dispatch, well, we're happy to have you anyway. We've had some very helpful volunteers to take notes and Jabber relay. So now I got to remember who they are. Steve and Pete are taking notes for us, and Jonathan is Jabber relaying. You want to talk to that, Will?
Sure. So this is the Note Well. It is a description of the IPR practices that govern your participation in this working group and actually all IETF activities. It is, Monday morning of IETF week, and I see a lot of familiar faces, but if you are new, welcome, and make sure you read up on the privacy policy as well as the IPR implications of the statement. I'm happy to talk with you after the meeting about it, or you can chat with one of our ADs if you have any questions. We have, I think, all 3 ADs in the room, which is really great.
I'm going to let Patrick do all the talking from here out. So we have a slight agenda bash. We reversed the order of the two dispatch items. Just because to make sure we had timing work out and some concern that rep might try to steal time. So unless anyone objects to that, we will go with the order on the screen, which is slightly different than the order on the in the materials. And since we are in the status and agenda bash section, I think the chairs have a few messages for us. I'm sorry, not the chairs. We're the chairs, the ADs. It's Monday morning, sorry.
Yes, hello, everybody. You might have noticed that we
State
have
your
a
name.
new... I couldn't quite hear that. Did you say my name?
Please state your name for the mic.
Alexei Melnikov. So you might have noticed that in front of the room, we have a new face. So Patrick is a new co-chair of Dispatch. Welcome, Patrick. Yeah, our ADs decided to rotate chairs, and we intend to do this more frequently in the future. So we would like to thank Mary for more than 10 years of co-chairing this working group. Initially in yes, so she started in dispatch in the RAI area and lived through transition and in art.
Mary was chair of dispatch from the very beginning, and I think she was the chair of SIPPing or something like beforehand. So she goes even further back than this
Well,
working
thank you,
group.
Mary. I think that's it from AGs. Oh, nope.
That's it from that AD. But this is Barry Lieba. But while I'm up here after that, I'll just add my thanks to Mary as well. She's really done a great job chairing this over the years. And the other thing I wanted to say was we have, thank you, the 5 of you who put your names in or at least accepted nominations for Art AD this time. Those of you who are in the room, Ben Campbell, Ben Schwartz, Dave Lawrence, Francesca Polombini, and Murray Kucheravi, if any of you are in the room, stand up so everybody can see who you are as they follow the next piece of what I'm going to say. The NOMCOM needs your opinions on these people. Please go to the NOMCOM website and in the data tracker and log in and give feedback, because that's how the NOMCOM figures out who will be best to appoint them. Yes, that's good. Eric suggested, thank you, that anyone on the NOMCOM in the room, please stand up as well. All right, that's all I had to say. Feedback, please.
Just to add on to that point, as a non-voting member of NOMCOM, the NOMCOM is open for office hours every morning this week from 9 to 10, so please drop by and provide feedback if you'd like to in person.
Okay, anything to further bash on the agenda? Thank you, everyone, for those comments.
And I think we're ready to move into our first discussion. Shrikant and/or Kaustubh. Right? Yes.
Okay. Hey guys, I'm Shrikant and I'm here with my colleague Kaustubh. So we are here to present the SIP auto peer. All right, so this is what we're going to cover in the talk in the next 10 minutes. I'm just going to move on to the first part. Right, so the first thing I want to talk about is give you basically a sense of the problem that we're trying to solve here. What we've got here on the screen is a typical enterprise deployment with the edge SBC in the middle talking to the SIP provider, the ITSP, and we are basically trying to fix problems in that interaction, in the interoperability between the SBC and the ITSP. So what we see today is administrators find it difficult to deploy these SBCs and get all of the call scenarios working. It takes a lot of trial and error to get the working configuration, right? And we want to help make their life easier. Earlier we had the legacy telephony networks, analog and digital circuits, which were easier to set up, which were quick and a breeze, and you only had issues in corner cases such as hardware problems. However, when you come to SIP and RTP, there are a whole set of parameters that are then introduced, which cause further issues. So getting that working config is time consuming, right? And usually the administrators have to open up tickets with the edge SBC vendor and the service provider, and then they work together to solve the problem. And this scales back the deployment times by a few days. So we want to reduce that to a few hours or even a few minutes. So the first thing we had to figure out was, how much of a problem this is. And for that, we went back to our support cases and we pulled the data for a year. And over the year, we saw there's about 6,000 cases on the SBC, and about 22% of those cases directly related to the SIP interoperability problem. So if you multiply, this was on our SBC, the cube. So if you multiply this with all of the SBCs that are there out in the market today, you can see that it's quite a significant problem that needs to be solved. Apart from that, a lot of the telephony deployments are still legacy, analog and digital circuits, and people are slowly moving over to SIP trunks. So this problem is not going away. We're just going to see more of this, and it's better to fix this as soon as possible. Right, so there are a couple of current solutions that are already there. The first one is the SIP Connect technical recommendations. So this is a really good document that provides a guideline to the SP and the enterprise on how they need to behave. It covers topics ranging all the way from initial registration of the device till complicated stuff such as call transfers, call forwarding, and even the security aspects and how to handle media. So all of these guidelines are there, and even though we can have SIP Connect compliant products, right? Today we still see interoperability issues, which we'll cover in the next slide. The second thing is the service provider documentation that's provided to the customer when they buy the SIP trunk. This covers only high-level information such as the authentication and a single server IP that you can communicate with. And apart from that, just basic codec information. However, it does not cover advanced features, which again we'll cover in the next slide, which cause problems when the testing begins. Apart from this, let's say tomorrow there's a new codec, right? Or there's a new parameter that's introduced. There is no efficient way today for the SP to inform the enterprise administrator about this. Usually what happens is the service provider enables this new feature or parameter, and then when a call is made, the call fails, and then there's troubleshooting that needs to be done. And that's when the administrator actually figures out that, hey, you know what? This config was missing on the SBC, so we need to start configuring the SBC this way. Right, so here are some of the issues that we still see today, which basically have no answers, right? So for example, when I'm sending the call to an ITSP, what happens if the ITSP forks that call, right, and creates multiple dialogues? Now, as an edge SBC, do I pass all of these forked dialogues, all the responses back to the enterprise? Or do I actually wait for a confirmed dialogue before letting the enterprise know? So it would be good to be aware of that fact. The second thing is, what about hairpin calls? So we have call forwarding and call transfers happening all the time on calls that come from the ITSP. So when the call is sent back, a lot of ITSPs actually wait for that first RTP packet to come from the enterprise side. And if that does not come from the enterprise side, then they don't stream RTP either. And this results in a no-way audio or a dead air issue. So again, that's another type of issue that we've seen. Now with supplementary services such as hold and transfers, there are many transactions that happen within a single dialogue. And we've seen that a lot of the time, the SPs reject that re-invite beyond a certain limit, or they just reject the re-invite altogether. So that's another thing that we've seen. We'd like to know how the SP routes calls. Does it route the calls based on the call party in the to field, in the request URI, or the P call party ID header? So it would be good to know that as well. As an enterprise, how do I send the call out to the SP? In the from header field, should I give the DID number that I bought from the service provider, or can I just encode any information, any user information? So that's another important issue that we've seen. And finally, now with the rise of video endpoints on the enterprise side, we see that a lot of calls actually are sent with the video M line. So there are many service providers that just are okay with this. They just change the video port to 0 and then respond saying that, I don't support video over this trunk. But there are others that actually reject the call altogether. So again, it would be good to know this beforehand. So coming to the SIP auto peer. So all of these scenarios that we've seen so far, right? We want to be able to give these answers to the administrator the day they are configuring the SBC, the first day itself, so that they don't have to go through this trial and error over days and just try to troubleshoot the problem and basically make life easier for them. We've encoded, the generic parameters that are applicable to any SBC in a Yang model. We've created the parameters and the framework in such a way that it can be parsed and this can be automated, so that there needs to be no manual intervention by the administrator. So the SBC can get the information, parse it, and then configure itself to get calls working fine, right? And another thing is we've covered from simple information, just such as the registrar IP or the call server IP, to something more advanced, such as the RTP scenario that I was just mentioning in the previous slide. And finally, we've created a data set, right, of the parameters, but this is by no means the final data set. We'd love some input on this because we want to solve as many problems as we can that administrators face today. That's the goal of this draft. So we are open to input on what we may have overlooked and what we could add and what we could refine in that capability set. All right, so this is a high-level overview of what exactly the draft does, right? There are just 4 steps. The first step is that the SBC gets the information of the capability server. That's the new element on the SP network. It just has to be a web server, right, that's hosted by the SP with the required capability set information. The Edge SBC gets this information, and you can either manually provide it or it can be discovered. Right, on its own. Once it gets that URL, it goes ahead and sends an HTTPS GET for the capability set. It gets the information in the response, and once it gets that response, it parses it and configures itself, or an administrator can go through that and configure the SBC as required. Right. So the first thing is, why HTTPS? Because why not HTTPS? Because it's the most common protocol. It's well established. It's the path to least disruption. You don't have to change. We're not trying to change the SIP stack here because that would be a mess. So HTTP is much easier to implement. That's why we've gone ahead with HTTP. And apart from that, most SBCs today already have an HTTPS stack built in. So all you need to give is that URL, and then they'll go ahead and query the HTTP server. Apart from that, there's no point of querying the capabilities once the trunk is registered between the service provider and the Edge SBC, because in order to get that registration up, you also need to provide information such as where the registrar server is and what the credentials are. So that kind of defeats the purpose. Right. So the second question that we had is, how do we encode this data? Right. So we are like on the fence about this, whether we should go with XML or JSON, because both of them have their pros. XML is synonymous with configuration files today. So most SBCs accept XMLs in the form of a document and then configure themselves based on that. So they have a parser built in. You also have XML schemas that has strong constraints. The only problem is that it's bulky and verbose, and you have to convert a document to a data structure, but that's okay. We have code that does that already. On the other hand, JSON is compact, it's readable, it's already data that's formatted as a map, right? So it has a bunch of advantages going for it. It's just the only weakness it has is it can't deal with unstructured data that well, but that's okay again. Right. So in this draft, we've tended to go towards XML just because we've seen it more in action. I'll be showing an example of that capability document in a future slide. Right. So the next thing is the Yang model that we've defined in this draft. So as you can see, these are parameters that are applicable to any SBC. It's not just vendor specific. It's very generic. It's as generic as can be. And we've covered transport information, call specification, media, security, and any kind of SIP extensions that are supported by the SP. Also, apart from this, the good thing about using a Yang model is that even if the service provider wants to encode vendor-specific information, they can just import this Yang model and then build on top of that. So they can add their vendor-specific information on top of that. All right, so here's the example of what that document looks like. Again, we went with XML just because we've seen more of it, that's all, but we've not made a final decision that it is going to be XML. We'd love to hear pointers on if JSON would still be better. I'm not going to go through all of the fields. This is just a slide to show what it would look like. So as you can see, all of the important parameters are there, and this is something that the SBC could just parse on its own and configure itself. All right, so the way forward, we want to hear any objections or challenges that you see, and we want to hear anything else that we can refine in that capability set. Like I mentioned before, it's not exhaustive, and we want to solve as many problems as we can so that we can make life easier for these administrators who are sitting out there and doing this every day, basically configuring and testing and provisioning SIP trunks every day with the service provider. So that's who we're targeting here, and that's who we want to make life easier for. So we'd love your inputs on refining the capability set and anything that we've overlooked. We've got a GitHub page, and we'd love to hear your inputs there. And yeah, I'd like to open up to the group as to how the draft should be taken forward as well. Thank you.
So in light of not everyone jumping to the mic, first, does anyone have any questions about the content of the draft or technical questions or comments? And I'm not seeing anyone. So then do people have opinions on what do we do with this? Is this something that the IETF should progress? And if so, what's the best way?
So, Has, I think the problem being listed is something that we have come across earlier in deployments, and I definitely think we should spend some time solving this. Draft proposes one way. We might have to probably think about what are the parameter sets that they are, and what are the defaults that we can also provide so that it's easy to auto configure if needed. And I totally agree there are some cases where manual intervention is required that we cannot remove. But if it can solve most of the use cases that we are dealing today, then I think it's worth doing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree there. Yeah. Basically, we can't hit all 100% of the problems, but at least 95%. If we can do that, that would be great. Yeah.
I appreciate those comments. Does anyone else have opinions on the use cases and sort of the problem statement as well? I mean, one of the things you addressed there was that you had seen this problem as well. I'm curious if there's a broad-based support for that comment. All right.
Just sort of curious question. Do we have people in the room from any SBC vendors?
Oh, half a hand.
I mean,
Are you half a person or half a vendor?
do you ever see this problem?
So I would never claim to be from an SBC vendor. No, so Gonzalo Cisco. So I work on the support side, and this problem's real. We see it, and we see it with enough frequency that it's worth solving.
Thank you.
So let me ask the authors, with respect to sort of the parameters, how much more effort do you think should go into the question of establishing the right set of capabilities and parameters?
So first of all, the parameters that we did come up with were after sort of going through a large number of cases, not just with Cisco, but stuff that we could find generally out there. I think the parameter set that we have right now is certainly not 100% representative of everything that could be solved by this framework. But I certainly think that with some dialogue, we ought to be able to reach to that parameter set pretty quickly.
This is Ben Campbell pretending to be from the floor. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ted.
And you were in line before me. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what are your thoughts on how fixed this capability set will be over time? Do you see it changing much as you find new areas of incompatibility, or are we talking about the same set of vendors that are pretty much done and not changing stuff?
Right. So unless there are going to be radical extensions to SIP and RTP, we don't expect the capability set to change a whole lot over time. So we expect it to remain pretty much static or usable for long durations of time. So.
Ted Hardy, in the Jabber chat room, we were sort of trying to figure out if this looked more like it belonged in one of these groups or needed new place to go. And one of the questions I had was whether not it were a new place, whether it belonged in this area or in ops/network management. And so I think my question to the authors is, how much dialogue have you already had with the folks in ops and NM about this? Because a lot of the Yang modeling work and stuff looks a lot more like their set of expertise than certainly what I would bring to the table if it came to here.
The simple answer to your question is we haven't had any dialogue, but we're open to finding a place that's most suitable for this effort. So.
Thanks for the answer. I think it might be valuable to consider chatting with the Ops and NM area directors as well as the ART area directors, because there are certainly pieces of this which they might have insight into the right communities of experts to help.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Alexei Manikov, as one of ART AGs, we just had a quick informal discussion between AGs. I think it probably makes sense to have a mini working group. I think we should keep the TED's question in mind, and ART AGs probably can talk to Ops and Management AGs and see whether this will land. But for me personally, not being a SIP expert or anything, this seems like a reasonable problem to solve and seems like a reasonable area to bring this to. So,
thank you.
Relaying for Robert Sparks. I'm Jonathan Lennox. But relaying from Robert Sparks from Jabber, he asks, have you had any conversations with SIP Connect or SIP Forum? Is this something that would be receptive to adding?
We realized that the SIP Connect, or rather the crux of the SIP Connect recommendation, is to actually smooth interrupt between enterprise vendors and service providers. So the direct answer to your question is no, we haven't had any dialogue with folks from SIP Connect. However, we look at this as pretty much a complementary effort, something that actually complements SIP Connect and makes lives easier for administrators.
This is Ben. I'm going to make Ben. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm going to make one follow-up comment on that. Is you really should talk to them.
Right.
Chris Went. I guess my only comment is I wonder if this is too little, too late. Like, with SIP Connect, it's good. It didn't catch on like wildfire. I know, like, generally when our customers connect with PBXs, it's sort of like, just painful enough that makes our life hard, but not painful enough that anybody wants to really change it and type of thing. So, I just wonder how motivated people will be to adopt a single standard here, because most vendors don't seem to align on anything from my experience.
So one thing that we're hopeful about is somewhere down the line that people sort of would see the economic and time benefits associated with this effort. On the part of a service provider, all that's really required of them at the end of the day is to just look at the capability set populated in terms of whatever it is that they do or don't do. And it's basically up to the enterprise after that to configure the SPC accordingly. So I think in light of the economic benefit and the amount of time that's saved, this could be something that motivates them to perhaps adopt down the line.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that. So another thing is that, we see that solution test teams today have a huge backlog of testing because of this, because they have to test with multiple providers. And we're just going to see more people migrating to SIP in the coming years. So this is going to become a bigger problem. So maybe when it's a bigger problem, then people might care. But the point is, let's fix it before it becomes that big problem.
Jonathan Lennox relaying from Mary Barnes. She says, given how we could never get folks to even agree on basic SIP device configuration, I'm not sure this will get anywhere. Not that I don't think it's a good idea. And SIP Forum tried to do device configuration, couldn't get traction. This might be a good thing to see if we can get a BOF at SIPNOC.
So I think, in our personal opinion, it's not so much as configuration as much as discovery of whatever it is that the service provider does, doesn't do, doesn't like. We are not advocating for the service provider, for example, to push configuration to the SPC. What we are advocating for is the administrator to have as much knowledge as possible on day zero.
So this is Ben Campbell from the floor, and then as a chair in just a second. From the floor, I would say one of the things I'm kind of hearing in the discussion is it would be good to have some input from the people that would implement this to make sure they really would. That would be both the service providers and the SBC vendors. And since we only had half a hand on SBC vendors earlier, we don't know the answer to that right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is a joint effort. This is definitely a joint effort. We need people from both SPs as well as SBCs here working on this, yeah.
And then speaking as chair, is there anyone in the room that thinks we should not work on this? We being the greater IETF and related communities. Okay, I think a little bit of summarize a summary of what I heard, and people feel free to interject if I have some of it wrong, is the people think in general this is probably worth doing. There's some concerns about whether it would be used if we do it. We think that it needs coordination with the people that would actually implement it and deploy. Yes, thank you. And the area directors have talked about it and considered that it might be worth a mini working group, and it's not clear if it belongs in art or ops or straddling the border of those. And that actually reminds me of one question I meant to ask a minute ago. Since the ADs made the comment this might be moot, but since you brought up SIPCORE, I think we have a SIPCORE chair in the room. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
We certainly could do this in SIPCORE, and I wonder if it is worth spinning up a mini group for it. I'm on the bubble. The workload right now is moderate, so time-wise, we've got time. You got shares and infrastructure, and all the people you really want to review are there. So the advantage of doing it in SIPCORE is you got this ready review crew, and there's enough time to do it. It's not a precise fit because it isn't core SIP, right? We're not changing SIP in any way. So by the strict reading of the charter, it's a little bit outside. I still think it probably makes a lot of sense to consider it, though.
So that's actually what I came over to say is this is Adam Roach. That yeah, we probably would want to like adjust the charter, and if we see like the pace that's going on in SIP core staying the same way it is, and more things like this coming along, we might want to sort of loosen things back to the way they were back when it was SIP.
Once upon a time, this is John Peterson, by the way, there was a working group called Modern, which actually still exists. It still exists in part because I insist that it be kept on life support because we're going to need it. Oh my God, there's like all this configuration stuff related to like stir and all these things that we're going to have to do at some point, and we're just too busy doing stir and shaken and everything at the moment. But it does exist as a bucket, and Steve Donovan, who is sitting over there, is still a Stuckey responsible for it. It's an alternative to consider. Modern, which is like managing, operating, like I don't even remember, man. It's really convoluted.
Okay, so John likes two relays. First for Robert Sparks. He says, this is very not SIP core. There's no actual SIP here, just nouns about SIP and RTP things. And then Mary says, I think a mini working group is better given ops and management type stuff. And I agree with John Peterson about Modern. If stuff works, there's no impetus for change.
I'm sorry, could you say the last part again?
Sorry, she agrees with John Peterson about Modern. If stuff works, there is no impetus for change.
And this is Barry Leba. I was, I'd said mini working group to start with. When Brian suggested doing in SIP core, I was good with that. Mary's point is well taken. We could certainly draw the right ops people in for the discussions, but it might be better to have a mini working group to highlight that and actually assign an ops advisor or something. So I'm ambivalent, but Mary makes a good point.
So I think at this point I'm sorry, go ahead, Colin.
It's just true. Colin Jennings, Benoit has been reviewing it from a Yang point of view and a little bit of ops review. So there's been a little bit, but doesn't change anything that people just said about the overlap and what we should do there.
Okay, so I believe that the resolution at this point is that people are thinking in terms of a mini working group, but the area directors are to go think about this. Is that the right resolution for the minutes?
No. I think saying we're leaning toward a mini working group is fair. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you might say it would not be a bad thing for people to start drafting a charter, and then we can see where that goes.
Okay, so then the next step is trying to work out what the charter would look like. And I think if you guys and maybe Cullen or someone can help you.
Adam Roach, the only other thing that I would suggest is that we probably want to put a call out on the dispatch list and or in this room about level of interest, like who would actually be willing to push things forward, review documents, et cetera.
Well, we can ask in this room right now. Who in this room would be interested in participating and working on this, whether that is from a writing documents or reviewing documents or perspective? So we're seeing in the 8 to 10-ish range, which is big enough for many working groups. So, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Make sure the notes caught that part. We saw 8 to 10 people and then we got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
So because it's Monday morning, go ahead. And then Colin's next. Because it's Monday morning and the chairs weren't on the ball, we forgot to send out the blue sheets at the beginning of the meeting. So we sent it out kind of in the middle of that discussion with no words. Or no words from us about it. So if anyone forgot the blue sheets, please, looks like we got it covered. Okay.
Okay, I'm here to talk about this RIP protocol, which has very little to do with the previous presentation at all. But it is about connecting up voice and possibly video things between different services and making this easier. So there's, a bunch of co-authors on this. Is very early work. It's not like all of us agree on any of this or anything. Or just that the ideas are gelling. Various people's positions on some of this stuff. I will try and highlight where it's key to things going on forward. Some of them are hilarious. My goal for today is really just to get people to understand a little bit the problem we're trying to solve, and then overview a little bit of a basic flavor of what we're thinking, though it could all change, and then get some scope of how big or small a problem do people want to solve, who's interested in, just sort of the range of how the information that we would need to start proposing and writing a charter. So what we're trying to do, I mean, this is similar to SIP trunking, right? There's all kinds of cloud services, whether they're WebEx, whether they're call centers, whether they're Hangouts, meeting conferencing systems, which initially are just trying to connect clients and then connect to the PSTN. So this work started with very much a PSTN focus. What do we need to do to make it easy to cross across to a service provider that has PSTN gateways and make that work? Now, at the same time, I'm going to talk in a second about the problems of doing that with SIP today and why the SIP solution is not really all that awesome for us in some ways. As we talk about this more and more, it becomes clear we'd also like to use it. Justin very much feels strongly we'd like to be able to use it from end user clients to the cloud. And along with that comes a much stronger desire for it to support video, not just audio, because it's not just a PSTN interop solution, and also ups the requirements for end-to-end security and stuff like this. So that's how the problems expanded since I talked about this 4 months ago. Everybody's like, well, isn't this just a SIP trunk? I mean, what's the problem there? And the problem is that SIP's sort of still done the way we did it largely 20 or 15 years ago. And we have these incredible cloud services that have built all kinds of infrastructure from gateways to load balancers to all of these things. And they're all focused around HTTP. They all leverage HTTP as a really good way to provide a lot of services, to build very stateless, highly distributed, highly reliable services. And SIP's really a bad match to them. If you try and deploy SIP in an AWS data center, you get basically nothing. You get largely some raw metal that you can run your stuff on. Where if you could have a way to do a lot of these same types of things over a mechanism that looks very much like HTTP, you could leverage an incredible amount of infrastructure that's been built to do that and do a much better solution. And that's really what we're proposing here, is to move to that type of environment. We can take advantage of that. So use cases, some of the ones I talked about of the straight up, you're running a large cloud data center and you want to be able to take advantage of those types of environments for PSTN interconnect. Okay, I won't really talk about these use cases too much. So it's the SIP trunking, those come up in all kinds of different cases. We have a lot of things that are difficult with SIP of as you're trying to just run VMs and tear them down and bring them up for reloads of software or whatever reasons, SIP does not have a lot of support built in for those types of management exercises or high reliability exercises where you can do it without ever degrading your service. Yes, people have managed to build incredible SBCs that can hide some of this and make it do and work in a high reliable way. But the protocol was never really designed very well for that. It wasn't one of the things it was trying to do, and it's very difficult to do. Also interested in just straight up enterprise voice trunking and making that very simple and easy to deploy, a lot of those types of things. That's expanding rapidly right now. I didn't mention it here, but there's also a lot of use cases around speech recognition services. So speech recognition right now has taken off like crazy, largely due to ML approaches to it. And the ML approaches require an incredible amount of data to train against, and the people that have huge amounts of data often have the best speech recognition systems because of the data they can bring to bear on the problem. So you see that with lots of people trying to use a small number of large cloud providers' speech recognition systems because they basically do better than ones that aren't large cloud ones. And we don't have particularly good ways. If you go across the APIs, across all the vendors, I'm not picking on anyone, it is that the streaming APIs for streaming real-time voice recognition across every vendor right now leave things to desire. So that's another use case that we're really trying to hit with this, and doing that from cloud to cloud. Ted.
Ted Hardy with a clarifying question. When you're talking about speech recognition here, obviously a lot of that is also moving on to devices at the moment with specialized systems. Are you particularly concerned with cases for the speech recognition where there's some other process which occurs after speech recognition, like IVR or translation to a secondary system, or are you really concerned with speech recognition itself? Because I'm a little confused.
That's a good question. So look, if the speech recognition happens on device, that solves a lot of privacy problems, is great for many cases. But if you're building a small, if you're a small startup company and you're building a contact center based on top of, say, Twilio's APIs or somebody like that, you are very likely to be calling out to Google's or some other large cloud provider's voice recognition system because it gets better results than any of the local systems or anything else. Like, the cloud systems do have a higher recognition rate than in anything else we've measured.
Tetrady, thanks for the clarification. It might be worth keeping in mind then that it's particularly the case where you want both voice recognition and then an interconnect to some other system, because that API is kind of a critical question that you eventually need to answer. Thanks.
So to give a flavor of the type of thing we're thinking about, and I wouldn't say any of these ideas are locked down in any way whatsoever, and I'm going to talk about how a bunch of them are different than the draft is even today. So in any one of these calls, they have, there's someone at the beginning, maybe it's offline ahead of time or what, but there's a way of understanding the capabilities of both systems at some level. There's a way of setting up a media flow and saying what actual capabilities you're using. This is Opus or this is G7, the facts about it. There's some event notification back, particularly when we're talking about PST interrupt call, the call's ringing, the call's answered, those types of ideas. And I think that's, it's one of the difficulties is the way that was mapped into SIP wasn't really ideal. It was always confused with how the billing was going to work. And then there's the actual media, audio and DTMF, and video is what this is expanding into, or the key ones we're thinking about right now. The capabilities, there's some proposal in this document for just a simple way to do capabilities. I'll talk about range of different ways we might solve that right now. I am arguing very much for a wholesale replacement of SDP to something much simpler based on the work that John and I did very many years ago on advertisement and proposals. Justin is at the far end of the spectrum from me as usual, and he is arguing for we totally use SDP offer answer. So if this strikes anyone as funny, it strikes both of us as funny because it's 180 from where we were on WebRTC. But there's some range of those in between. I'm going to skip the slide. Caller ID right now, Passport seems to be the thing we're looking at, open to other ideas there. But we need some identity mapping. The protocol mapping, there's some rough proposal how to move this into HTTP-like requests where you can, have objects representing calls and state and information about that. I would view all of this right now as a laughable straw man at the beginning of it, and we need to sort of refine that and bring that in. But we want, the point here is we want to do it in a way where we can take advantage of all the ways we build modern applications in HTTP-based data centers and take advantage of the infrastructure that there's that use it and make sure that we can use those for voice calls, not just other applications. The media byways was a way to send real-time media both directions by striping multiple transactions over an HTTPS connection. I think this was an initial sort of stab at something to get something down, but I really think that if the web transport stuff goes well this week, we'd probably move to something like that. I don't think any of us are very are thrilled with this exact design if we can figure out something better. Jonathan largely wrote this up to show that something is possible. Like, here's proof of existence of we could do something. And, variations of this have been implemented by many voice over IP systems over the years. So it's not like there's that much to invent here. But we're I think that the desire is moving to something largely running over QUIC, because we believe QUIC will be supported in the data centers with probably unreliable transactions, which we'd like to see going there. So that's where we're thinking on some of that transport stuff. Events, this is our simple set of events that we have right now of the feedback information. I don't think much more than this is needed. I think that pretty much deals with it. We're interested in being able to do things like have both sides say to move a call because they need to administratively take down a server and bring up another one, or load balance, or many of those issues. So either side of this sort of trunk that's going on can move it to a different server. And that embedding that in the design from day one really makes it a lot easier to deal with some of this stuff. And when I say move, I mean it's moving the signaling and the media, which are both shared over the same connection. Security, TLS hop to hop, OAuth for some of the client authentication stuff. End to end, when our scope was only PSTN, we didn't really see a need for end-to-end security because it really went from one hop to the PSTN gateway where then all security ended. So that one hop was already secured. The end-to-end wasn't going to buy you anything there. And so, but as we move to using it down to clients and expanding out the use cases for use in down to clients and a broader sort of things in video, then clearly some sort of end-to-end security needs to be put in here. Rough thinking right now, people have been sort of vaguely talking about the ideas of MLS, but we need a clear identity mechanism. I mean, we need to know who's encrypting it to who. We don't, or else not really, it's susceptible to man in the middle. So that part needs some big questions and some big answers there before we figure out what to do. We're looking for feedback on that. So this is my questions where I'd love some feedback. The problem scope is the biggest thing right now. When we originally thought about this, we were thinking only between data centers and PSTN gateway providers. And it was for PSTN on ROP. Now we've expanded that out quite a bit for like the speech recognition case. And we're talking about moving out to audio and video and also to endpoints. Anyone have feedback on this one way or another?
Hello, Bernardo Boba, Microsoft. I think a lot of the ideas have applicability in all of those things. That doesn't mean you should try to do them all with one protocol. But I mean, the basic paradigm you described could be used for many of those things.
Chris Wendt. I think, I've been thinking about this stuff in multiple contexts. We've been talking about video relay services, like in FCC context. We've been talking about, just like a lot of people are building WebRTC gateways that support audio and telephone calls and other things like that. I think the fundamental problem is that video has turned out to be pretty much multi-party context with no features, no application features. But we have this thing in the PSTN side where for enterprise telephone calls, for any complex thing, we have all these, diversion, all this stuff, and when you talk about like end-to-end security and all this stuff, if you're passing calls like all over the place and it's being forwarded, it just like becomes a complete mess. So, in the way that we've implemented things, we sort of try to abstract that stuff. But the problem is the applications sort of like, you have the N and I on one side, you have the applications and the network, and then you have, the essentially pure connection thing that goes from the application to the actual endpoint. And at the end of the day, that's just about media. I mean, there is the other complication of terminals that actually implement applications as well and other things like that. But like, I think, I haven't really scoped that too well, but I think that hopefully that illustrates part of the problem I think we're facing when we try to look at supporting things in terms of trunks or trying to combine the world of video and current telephony.
That makes sense.
Eric Scrolla. So, this feels a little like fighting the last war. So when SIP was like first designed, it was designed as a quasi like decentralized, quasi peer-to-peer system with centralized signaling, and that didn't work out like as well as we were hoping, and we kind of got like centralized like everything, and like I can certainly see like one would have the urge to be like, well, let's just like declare defeat and be like, let's have like centralized everything, and and design a system which doesn't have any of those mechanisms because it's like this quasi centralized, but like to do that at the same time as like as like the PSTN is dying and like over the top is taking off, and end-to-end encryption is like more important than ever. I mean, just seems like this is the design one might have done 20 years ago, and now we're talking having this design now and not having a like design which is like endpoint first. Now just like seems to be the wrong direction. So I mean, if you have designed like some new thing that like uses quick and like and is and doesn't use SDP or like doesn't use SRTP or whatever because you think that like the modalities those things were set up for, like that seems like a reasonable thing to talk about. But like starting from the position that like you're gonna have a design which is like inappropriate for anything with centralized conferencing, like centralized calling, just like I'm having trouble getting on board with that.
So I mean, fair enough. I got your point. I should be clear too. I should have said this at the beginning. I have no thought that this is going to replace anything that people are doing with SIP today. It's about building the new applications on top of that.
Sure. Well, I guess, and then so like but that makes me very sad because now you're basically now you're putting the design together, which will have an enormous amount of friction when you try to actually use it for like any kind of like peer-to-peer calling.
You're. Why do you want to say like why do you believe MLS would not be appropriate there, or are you what?
I mean, like I don't want the media to go to some central location. Like I mean, like this is a design. This is a client server design with potentially over the top encryption. And encryption slapped onto it.
Right. You're not talking about security. You're talking about the media routing going through a centralized server versus peer to peer.
In part, I mean, this is just designed as a star configuration, like clearly.
Sure, yeah, totally, yeah.
But the fact that then it also has like hand wave, maybe insert end-to-end encryption here, like is like a little distracting as well, right?
Right. So I will say that the reality of current deployments, including all the new systems, do seem to largely be using that cloud server mediated media path. Right. I mean.
Jonathan Lennox, on the question of just audio or audio and video, I think a lot of the reasons why video, a lot of the things that make video so annoying in both RTP and SDP is that they were both designed with, let's do audio first, we understand that, and we'll retrofit video later. And it turns out that video is very different and has a lot of new requirements, and retrofitting them on is hard. So I would say either design this with video from the beginning or explicitly declare video out of scope. Don't say you're going to add video later.
John Peterson, and I love when the IETF divides things into you and I and N and I. I finally feel at home here in the IETF. And that's actually what I guess I wanted to say about the first bullet here. I mean, I think if you're going to do this and just declare N and I, which one could, maybe something that might soften the blow of Becker's despair there is it have at least some requirement for what a UNI would be that would then interface with this in a way that would enable end-to-end security without necessarily being prescriptive about what that UNI interface is going to be. Because to Chris Wendt's point, I mean, it's very pluralist. It could be, WebRTC or something, right, that is connecting up to WebEx, and then WebEx is talking across to Comcast. And I can imagine there being an NNI, as much as, the words turn to ashes in my mouth, defined here in the IETF for precisely those kinds of cases, but only if it then had these hooks. Say, okay, any UNI that is going to work with this must provide the following things that enable end-to-end security. And I think they probably are available on like WebRTC and things like it, right? But I could see you dodging the bullet that way, not doing between endpoints, just doing the between data center server parts, but just putting requirements on UNIs that can interface with them.
Brian Rosen, I have this feeling when you got up here and said, oh, now we're going to talk about endpoints, that this is SIP 3.0. I mean, you're talking about redesigning the protocol for creating multimedia connections across the internet. And it might really be time to talk about that. I'm not afraid of opening that, but what I am afraid of is sidestepping into it, because that's what we did with SIP. And we didn't say, no, we're really talking about a protocol for doing multimedia communications over the internet the right way. If we're going to do that, and we might want to do that, it might be the right time to talk about doing that. But let's decide that that's what we're going to do, and not do something small that turns into the wart on the elephant. Please.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's the same thing Jonathan said about a slice of it. You're saying about the whole broad thing.
Mosinati, 2 points on the scope. Endpoints and video greatly magnify the amount of work that's going to have to be done for this. The amount of complexity that comes and the ugliness that we think lies in SDP and SIP and things like that is not really just syntactical ugliness. There's a lot of complication that video and endpoint specific audio formats are. If you're talking about just going to a ITSP, there's usually a very simple set of rules that you could use and you could standardize that and that'd be easy. Adding endpoints to the mix to allow endpoint to endpoint even communication, that greatly expands the universe of codecs and formats and when you add video, another 2 to 4x factor. So I think it's good to keep those in mind, but somebody has to be conscious that this is easily a 4 to 8x amount of effort for adding those things in the scope.
Eric Squirrel again. So, I mean, I guess this is dispatch, not BOF. So, usually that as I recall, John would recall better than I do, but the usual things here are, this should be AD sponsored. Killer or fire, this should be AD sponsored. There should be a BOF or ticket assisting working group. I think clearly, we can't be AD sponsoring this. That's way too big. Clearly, it can't go to existing working group. Also, way too big. I don't think, despite my concerns earlier, I'm not sure I'm ready to say kill it with fire. So I think the only plausible outcome here is you need to you need to put together a buff proposal for the next next ITF, right? Or some future ITF. I guess we could give you a mailing list.
I had a couple more slides on this, but I think that we're actually getting to the heart of what's the actual important part of things to discuss right now. So I'm fine with this discussion. We can end wherever we need to end. And Ecker, it's clearly to me, it needs to be a working group. I totally agree on that.
And so I think at that point, once you come with a proposal that has a working charter or a scope, then we can debate whether or not those are the right things. But trying to do that here isn't going to help. Right?
Well, and I mean, it was the point I started this slide deck on too, is I'm trying to get the information to help write a proposed charter is about the stage
Right.
this is at.
Well, I guess
right?
so my put would be I'd like you to have more. I'd like you to have more accommodation consideration for the cases that's centralized.
Okay, that's good feedback.
So one comment from the chair, this has been the one thing I think Ecker left out of his list is that we can dispatch things directly to a mini working group or that sort of thing, or even a full working group and build charter work in here if the ADs want to do it that way. But I'm not saying that's what we should do, but it's still an option.
I mean, I think Brian's characterization of this as SIP 3.0 or at least maybe 2.9, but probably 3.0, this is not a mini working group, right? Yeah.
New area.
Mark. No.
Mark. Wow. On that note, Mark Nottingham. So are you giving up on your presentation, or is there more to come? I have a more general comment. I'm happy to wait. I'm happy to do it now.
Okay on time.
I'm giving up on my presentation.
Okay. We have a solid 15 minutes left. So if people want to ask questions about the technology and explore that further, we got some time. We can also go right into the dispatchy questions if you. Okay. So
I'm going to put slides in front of people though while they're talking, just for the fun of it.
Just randomly. Yeah.
Random slides.
You are teasing Mark with the slides.
So,
you just pop up here and not talk about.
I just would like to make a suggestion, and it's going to require some work on your part, but you will have the eternal gratitude of the community, and I'll buy you a drink. Okay. So we have this draft in HTTP working group called BCP 56 BIS. It is surprisingly a revision of BCP 56, which is how to use HTTP as a substrate for application protocols, and it is attempting to give advice and best practice for how you build something on top of HTTP to get the most out of the infrastructure, which sounds like what you're trying to do, and document well-known pitfalls and so forth. I would love it if this were to actually, if you decide to do this, if you overcome the other hurdles you have, when you start that process, to look at that document and either take its advice and change what you're doing where necessary, or tell us why you don't think you need to change, or tell us why you didn't, just report back And that would help us make sure that that document is doing the right thing, because we're seeing more and more, we've talked about this before, we're seeing more and more protocols using HTTP. They're kind of all over the map, and so we need to document these best practices. We think it's done. We're just waiting for the HTTP core documents to finish so that they can be referenced, but there's still time to incorporate feedback. So it would be ever so helpful and drink-worthy if you were to do that.
And I suppose you want feedback more than my last time when I said we should deprecate the draft was the feedback. So like more constructive than that.
Well,
fair enough, Mark. No, you're totally right.
This speaks to drink quality, Fluffy.
Okay. So I think that the thing is, maybe I can try. Maybe there's a couple other people who know HTTP fairly well and WebRTC and the problems went wrong with it that could help scope some of this into that. I think we need some HTTP expert. Look,
so here's the problem.
We need some HTTP clue involved with the people who are sending real-time media over quick, right? Like we're not debating that.
Sure.
So how do we get a short call together with that group of people and sort those things out and provide feedback for BCP 56?
I think it'd be great if you looked at the document first and then had that discussion, because the HTTP clue doesn't scale. There are a lot more people trying to build protocols on top of it than we have people available to give those kinds of reviews, because they have day jobs and so forth and so on. So if you just start by doing that, and then we can try and give you some resources.
Okay. No, fair enough. I'll do that.
Okay. Thanks.
I want to drink though.
Chris went. I generally agree with the discussion going on, but to try to go back to my original point, I think there has to be some explicit, scope that's decided. That are we trying to solve, some interoperable peer-to-peer signaling or multi-party signaling, or are we trying to solve things like how contact centers interface with different interconnection points and all this other stuff? Because I think those are two completely different problems.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess we can explicitly open the floor for questions on sort of dispatch suggestions.
Brian Rosen, I keep thinking that if you try to limit the scope, somebody's going to come for the next meeting and expand the scope. And unless that we really are better off maybe starting with a subset. In other words, saying, well, we're not going to boil the ocean in the first version of the protocol. But if our intention is to think about doing this over, then let's design it that way, even if we're starting with a limited scope, which I absolutely admire or recommend doing. Start with limited scope, just don't have that in mind. Don't think that the only piece we're doing is that whatever you start with, because I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think, especially if it's good, especially if it succeeds, we will have the problems that we created in SIP.
Right. So, I think a bunch of things I heard today really rang true with me. First of all, I totally believe that this group of people will inevitably expand this to fill all the space, all this type of problems that it wants to. It'll be a very broad scope, right? Video, as Ecker points out, peer-to-peer. So it seems like we need to, we didn't deal with a lot of those things when we designed SIP from day one. It was very much a trapezoid model and with proxies, which then didn't exist. I think we have to learn from that. And like what Jonathan said about video, you can't add it later. We can't add peer-to-peer security later. We're going to have to hit all of those from the beginning. Like, as I was listening to everyone talking, like that seems inevitable to me. We could discuss for a long time how big that ocean is and how much we wish it was smaller. But in the end, I doubt we're willing to go forward unless we solve some of those problems or have a picture of how they're going to be solved. So I think that's the direction I'm leaning right now on thinking about this, which does not make it a mini, mini anything.
So you began your presentation saying you were sort of seeking advice on helping to build that charter. Do you think that's been our proposed charter? Do you think that's been accomplished, or?
Definitely on the overall scope and the importance of why we need to bring some of these things in. I think that one of the things I would say, particularly in this negotiation scope, is one of the decisions we made in WebRTC, which extremely limited WebRTC, was that we were going to try and gateway to SIP from WebRTC without processing the media. And I think that the view here is to not have that limitation, not worry about the past, not worry about backwards interoperability, and any gateway to an existing SIP system would require full gateway of the media. And that's just the nature of being able to remove all the limitations we had in designing WebRTC. If people strongly disagree with that, I'd love to hear. I think when I think about the security stuff, one of my biggest problems or one of my biggest questions is, you know, how we deal with the identity stuff. I would love to hear people, not right now at the mic, but just come and talk to me this week and talk about how can we make a how can we make the end-to-end security in a way that was actually work? What would our design like that look? How would we scope that? Because that's one of the problems I really struggle with. And yeah, I think this is a good place to stop.
So this is Ben speaking for the chairs. Just listening to everything we've heard here, and I mean, I see that there seems to be interest. The scope needs to be constrained yet big. Almost all of the scope questions came down to, yeah, it'd be good if we can constrain this, but people are going to add on to it. And the chairs think there's probably cross-area impact here. This is not just purely art, because we're talking about transport issues and all these things. So we're feeling like what we're hearing, trying to integrate everything we're hearing in the room, is that we're talking about a buff. Yeah. And yeah, so I was going to duck to see if you threw something at me when I said that.
Well, you know, I mean, the way we did WebRTC from this point in WebRTC to the point we had a working group was about 2 years. I was going to make a slide on that. We need to do better than that. We need to figure out, like, IETF is going to fail if that's our process. But I don't disagree with we need a BOF at all on this. Never mind this slide. But so, you know, but I think we should get moving on it and figure out how to have a BOF that moves quickly.
So looking at your slide, you would get a charter to the IESG, would be getting a BOF charter to the IES, or a BOF proposal to the IESG. Is that what we're talking about?
I mean, this whole discussion has expanded the scope greatly than when I wrote this slide.
Right.
But I think the thing that we need to think about as a group is, how do we move things along quickly versus doing them the way we've always done them? And that doesn't remove the need for a BOF on something this large. Okay, I'm not arguing that in the slightest.
So I'm hearing you say we need to do the things we've always done, but just do them faster.
Let's figure out where we can. A lot of our discussions have the nature of everybody knows where it's going to end 8 months from now, and we spend 8 months having the discussion. We need to figure out how to make those discussions take less than 8 months.
This is Barry Leba. Given that we think we want to have a BOF on this in Vancouver, that restricts when we could get something formal. But we can certainly set up a mailing list and have people continue writing documents and move this forward while that happens. And I don't think we should wait.
For sure.
Pete Resnick, there is no reason you can't do a virtual BOF and have it happen before Vancouver and move things along more quickly as per what you're looking at. If you want to move quickly, do things now, do things not face-to-face.
And Robert Sparks. Cullen, right now you own the delay. Give Ecker the discussion. Give Ecker the discussion he was looking for example.
I knew I was going to get that comment. That's very fair, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it that way. Eric Squirrel again, but I think, you know, you're certainly right to say that. That you know, sometimes discussions, everyone knows where it's going to go 8 months from now, and it just takes forever to get there. But I guess I don't know where this is going to go. So I think, you know, like, you know, obviously you've been around this before, so like, you know, I think your next steps are like one-to-one in a small group, socialize these ideas and try to like people's feedback and try to come back with a proposal that you think addresses like most of the people's feedback, and then like, yeah, then we can crank it through fast. But I think the problem right now is not the process. The problem right now is consensus. Now, I'm not saying you can't get to consensus quickly, but the problem right now is not that. I mean, the reason people are saying you should have a BOF is not just because it's a lot of work, but it's also because it's like there's appears to be like a fair amount of like non-total agreement on what ought to be done.
Okay.
Hi, Aaron Falk. Trying to think a little bit out of the box in terms of process. Is there anything that would prohibit having a BOF in one of the open sessions later in the week?
I don't think we could be seriously ready for that from my take, but I don't think there's anything that I don't think there's any process thing that eliminates that. But I do not think the advocates of this would have something that answered people's questions really put together by that point.
Right. I'm thinking because there's the the whole idea we get together face to face is to have the high bandwidth discussions. So
yeah.
Alyssa Cooper, we could update that RFC about how to have a successful BOF, but like, don't plan it 2 days in advance as one of the recommendations. Just musing about this a little bit. I think the 2 years that it took to charter RTC Web is small compared to the 8 years it took to complete the documents. And so you might also think how to correct for that, given that it's a overlapping set of interested parties in an effort of approximately potentially similar size. So maybe don't just, I mean, and in that case, I feel like there's actually very clear agreement about the scope when the thing actually finally got chartered, and yet the 8 years still passed. So just something to think about.
I totally agree. It's been deeply on my mind. I will say that some people believe the solution to that is only involve people in the consensus process who are implementing it, which would take it outside the IETF.
Ted Hardy, just reflecting something said in the room, which was obviously what WebRTC needed was better chairs. As one of the chairs, I'm sure that that's true. And my apologies to you, Cullen, as one of the other chairs.
Totally agree, of course.
But I think you actually touched on a way to make this faster in your presentation and possibly weren't holding it up quite high enough for people to realize it. And that is, you're changing the interoperability strategy here very fundamentally by saying you will no longer care to make it simple to do interoperation with legacy devices. And the interoperability strategy that was taken up by WebRTC was to make it simple to do interoperation with legacy devices by presuming that the gateways themselves were very simple devices and not responsible for the media. And I think if you do change that interoperability strategy and say this new thing is not in fact SIP 3.0 and it will not care to do simple interoperation with previous versions of SIP or WebRTC, but is presuming that any interoperation goes through an arbitrarily complex gateway, then your engineering task got a lot simpler. And a lot of the fights we had in WebRTC, the codec one and many of the others, were proxy fights around the simplicity of interoperation with legacy code. And I strongly urge you, if you want speed, hold tight to that new interoperability strategy, because the minute you let it go, the amount of work you have to do goes up by several orders of magnitude, and the amount of time you will spend will stretch until when maybe our grandkids can see us as participants in this working group, as opposed to our children who grew up during the last one.
So a chair comment, that solid 15 minutes we said we had is almost done. I think what we've heard still is we're talking about a BOF. We want to find ways to make it move fast. I see that the comment about having a BOF this week is probably not realistic, but are you looking at side meetings this week?
No, we tried scheduling side meetings last time. It's just too hard to resolve the conflicts. So not really. I mean, if people have a time that they think a side meeting would like to do it, I'm totally open to that, but it's didn't really work for us last time.
Mosinati, since you're presumably looking to use web transports and they're having a BOF later this week, would it make sense to try to have a bar BOF after that? Because, I mean, web transports doesn't exist for itself. It exists for applications on top of it. And this is a prime application. So if that work moves forward, understanding the needs of a real application, a big application, we could move faster too in maybe getting all the right things that we need out of web transport for our application.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Maybe a bar BOF after after the Wednesday meeting or something?
Okay, so I think the resolution we have here is that the proponents and the area directors will discuss how we can accelerate moving forward with the BOF. The idea of a virtual BOF was mentioned. I don't know if it's doable, but it's worth discussing. I noticed you had a virtual interim in February on your slide. Maybe that could be a virtual BOF. I don't know. We do see a lot of interest in working on this. I guess the next steps is, like I said, proponents talk to the ADs and figure out how we can move this faster, see if we can get at least a BOF description proposal together quickly.
Yeah, okay. And if there's other people who think they could help craft charter text on this or a BOF proposal thing, I'd really appreciate them reaching out to me.
Alyssa Cooper, there are a bunch of meeting rooms left in a Thursday morning open slot with nothing that would conflict with
Okay, there's
the
nothing
interest
for
for this. So if you want to take a
So-
look, but
Can one of the ADs help me schedule one of those Thursday morning slots then?
it's a wiki. You just sign up. I will send you the link, Colin. Give me a break.
That's where this all goes wrong, though, is like, and then, yeah, then we have like 20 conflicts. So, yeah. Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
So we're now moving into the art area part of the meeting. I assume that's mostly the same people. So welcome everyone to the art area part of the meeting. The first item we have is we've got some BOFs out there and some other groups of interest. And I think we have a slide. Oh, no, that didn't work. Hang on. Got to use the machinery right. Why are we going backwards? Okay. You want to talk about it? You want me to talk about it?
You can talk about it.
Okay. So we do have a couple of new and/or interesting work groups. Obviously, all the working groups are interesting, but these are the ones we felt like calling out. In particular, we like to call out Gen Dispatch and then also mention Security Dispatch, partially because we're so proud parents of all these new dispatch working groups, but also I think everyone's interested in Gen Area Dispatch, and there's a lot of overlap between things that are going on in this room and things that go in Security Dispatch as far as the people that need to think about them. So we would hope as many art participants as possible can attend Security Dispatch. And Ted.
I was actually Ted Hardy. I was actually waiting till you got to Wednesday 13:30 to discover that web transport had been taken over by the DNS, and to suggest that maybe we wanted to stop that. It's going to be a complicated enough thing to discuss without having to do applications doing DNS there.
It has been a long chair tradition to hide Easter eggs in slides. See if people find them.
All right, so we will highlight the art BOFs and try and clarify the typos, I suppose, and give folks who are participating in these BOFs a chance to talk about what's going on and maybe garner some attendance. ABCD, would someone like to talk about ABCD on Tuesday? Oh,
whatever's easiest.
So this one's probably Dave Lawrence. This has probably been super easy to overlook because like it really hasn't been too much of a topic of discussion around various IETF forums. But a while ago, we started this whole we started this whole well, we thought about having a bar BOF, but it's pretty clear at this point that we'd need like the biggest bar ever in every sense of the word. But in this particular case, what I'm driving at is that, a few years ago, we started this whole, let's work on privacy for protocols at the IETF, and that led to the DNS privacy working group, DPRIVE, that rolled out, among other specs, DNS over TLS draft. And then 2 years ago or so, we started the DNS over HTTPS working group with the idea that we could have a pop-up working group, get in, get out, and we would solve one problem and be done. Turned out that was just kind of turning the key on opening a whole lot of other things. And some of these topics that the DNS over HTTPS has brought to light are clearly very thorny issues, but there's also pretty clear to a number of us that there are some technical issues that we can address in a relatively policy neutral way. And so ABCD is going to be the intent is that it is a working group forming BOF where we can hope to come to some agreement on just what types of problems we can solve in the IETF, kind of based on the understanding that like refusing to work on these areas doesn't mean they don't get worked on, but at least if we can do them in the IETF, we can get some sense of cohesion on the technical direction that these things go in, and hopefully end up with better engineered solutions. So, do any of the ADs want to add anything about that?
Thank you. We should also talk a little bit about the web transport BOF, which has nothing to do with applications doing DNS. We apologize for the, as we talked about, that does seem to go everywhere, so it's apparently found its home here on the slide.
So web trans is on Wednesday at 1:30, has nothing to do with DNS. As far as we know, we don't have any intent to figure it out either. And so if I could put it in a nutshell, what that's about is I think of it as the next step beyond WebSockets. So we're going to start off by introducing some of the work that's been done on quick datagrams, although that really isn't central to what we're doing, just as a little bit of background. And then talk about a couple of proposals for taking the next step beyond WebSockets. I think there's something called the Web Transport Framework. There's 2 proposals on HTTP2, enhancing Connect. And then talk also a little bit about use cases. And I think Cullen covered a couple in there that are some of the things people have been thinking of doing. And we've got 90 minutes, but time flies when you've got so much material. So David and I still have to work through how much we can do and how much should be allocated so we can have a reasonable amount of discussion and Q&A as well as just talking to you with slides.
And David Skenazy, a quick point to add. So this is work in partnership with the W3C. That is, so WebSocket is an API available to the web via W3C stuff, and they're interested in leveraging new transport protocols, most notably Quick, and offering those rich features to the web. So we were there, in particular at TPAC a few months ago, and there was interest there. So the idea here is, let's see what we can build in terms of IETF protocols to support that work.
Okay. And also on Wednesday, we have the WPAC web packaging BOF, which also has nothing to do with DNS, or not much in any event. This is the sort of logical progression of the work that Jeffrey Yaskin has presented, I think, in Dispatch in the past, involving HTTP and essentially offline signed exchanges and what that means when separated from sort of a transport context and the security and distribution considerations of that. And so that's what we'll be talking about. That is a potentially working group forming BOF Wednesday afternoon. If Jeffrey's in the room, I would give him a minute to talk about it. I don't think I see him, though. No. Okay.
And then we have a few BOFs that are outside of the art area, but may still be of interest for people. If anyone is in the room that is in a position and would like to plug them, they're welcome to. I'm assuming that's not going to be true for mathematical mesh because that BOF is going on now. But as far as the other 3, is anyone here that's a chair or is otherwise interested who can speak to them?
Hi, Justin Richer. Transactional authorization is going to be happening this afternoon, and we're basically going to be looking at sort of future next generation protocols of how we do authorization delegation systems like OAuth, but hopefully less messy, at least to start.
Any others? Okay, so I think it's time then to move into our first discussion in the art area, which I believe is Braun.
Sure.
All righty, this is way too short. Hang on a second. That's better. All right. So here's the problem space. We have user devices that want to get information from some service provider on the internet and want to know when something's changed at that service provider on the internet. generally, there's two ways to do this. You can keep a connection open, which chews up battery, and which, depending on the protocol, there's no really good way other than polling. Or you can push via some kind of cloud service that the device is connected to all the time. There's already some stuff that exists. I can't remember what I put in the slides here. In this space, Apple have their own thing, Apple Push, which exists in IMAP and exists in CalDAV and CardDAV. And their devices will connect to a server that supports it. And it says, please push me updates through the Apple notification service back to the device, and it will know that something's changed. And in close to real time, it gets updates. For other first-party clients, like the Gmail client with Gmail, again, they will get pushes straight away through their protocol because they control both ends and they can put something in between back there, and it all works nicely. For third-party clients, they're pretty much out of luck. They're stuck polling, or they're stuck implementing every single service provider's custom protocol just for them. So there are a couple of, isn't this great? Couple of existing drafts for this. For CalDAV and CardDAV, there's been a proposed draft to add push just to there. And for IMAP, there's now a proposed draft to add a push mechanism there as well from the Dovecot people. All of these, it would be good to have a standard way of doing it so everyone's not implementing their own thing. JMAP has implemented its own thing because there was nothing else, but it would be good to make sure that anything else that comes along the lines with that. So I guess my question for this group is, where should this work happen? Well, first of all, should it happen at the IETF? Where should it happen at the IETF? And who wants to get involved in it?
So Colin James' question about this is, I mean, isn't there Apple and Android's push notification service, which every single third party today, love it or hate it, uses codes to those two so they can do push notifications, right? Is that relatively true? Is that?
Yes, it is. Okay. So roughly there are currently two of those.
Yeah.
But what doesn't exist is a standard way to tell the service provider to push through those channels.
Or so more specifically, there's two, there's Google's way and Apple's way.
Yeah.
And there would be nice to have one way.
But the average protocol doesn't have that built in. You can't just go to a random CardDAV server and say, please push me updates to my address book via my protocol that I know how to recognize through the Google push channel.
Right. So, I mean, I think the question that I'd be looking for, I'd love this. I argued for something like this many years ago, but it doesn't matter unless both those two push notifications that are everything today are willing to implement that API. Unless they're willing to do that, that seems to be the important question.
You can either put something in front of them that talks your API and then knows about those two, which is certainly one of the possibilities, or you can just specify those two as specific options. They don't need to care. All they're doing is transporting some kind of payload to the device on your behalf, and they'll do that for all sorts of things already. But you need to have a way to tell the service provider, I want you to push to Google, or I want you to push to Apple in this format that my third-party app will recognize when it comes through to me.
The third-party app has to be registered with the cloud service, or they won't deliver it for security reasons, right?
The third-party app can just register. Well, it can have its own device ID, whatever it needs to register to the cloud service and say, here's my ID. Yes.
Okay. I guess I think this is overly simplifying what you're like. The picture you said of like there's somebody like Twilio who provides a common API that then pushes it to the Android and Apple backend. I can imagine that working, but I think you need to describe.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just the rough scope.
Hi, this is Neil Jenkins. Yeah, just clarifying the scope of this a little bit. This is about if you have a third-party client that's going to talk to a mail, contacts, calendar, or whatever server, which is not owned by the same company. It needs some way of saying, hey, I have this push channel that I can receive stuff from. And so that app registers, yes, a certificate with Apple or Google so it can receive pushes, but it needs to have some way of getting the service provider to push information in a way that's going to end up routing back to that client. And that might, so we have RFC 8030, which is kind of how all this can all work together in a standardized way. But what we need is a standardized way for the client to set up that whole channel with the service provider. That's my attempt at clarifying that, which may not be that clear. But
thanks, Neil.
Seth Gentle, sorry, Neil, you might have just answered my question, but I'm trying to be clear on whether there's a point of clarification. Is this third-party applications, so the Twilio app on my phone, or is this specifically for things like calendaring and email where I don't necessarily install an app for my particular service provider on my phone, but we want to be able to connect to a calendaring service, and then I want the specific app on my phone, which is not connected to that service, to be able to then register for push notifications?
Yeah, the idea is that you install Cool Calendars on your phone,
Yep.
and Cool Calendars connects to your CalDAV server and says, hi, I'm an app that's on a Android phone, so please push to the Google notification service with my app's registered ID against Google to tell me when there are changes to my account on your service.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Sean Leonard, I think that this is good work to pursue, or within IETF, and you asked the question of where. So why not have it done in Extra? I guess, is there a more appropriate place than that? Seems like Extra is pretty good.
Cool. I mean, I'm happy to take it in Extra. Extra's finishing up the current work that it has pretty soon.
Yeah,
but I
at
wasn't
the
sure if
moment,
it's the right
Extra
home.
Charter is very IMAP specific, so this is going slightly beyond that. I mean, it's sort of related, but it's bigger scope.
Yeah.
This is Barry, but I think Extra will have the right people in the room for it. So rechartering Extra to cover it might be a better idea than doing another working group. What do you think?
I refuse to make a decision at this point. Yeah, probably. I need to think about that.
Cool. Yeah, obviously, I put a slide here with some of the considerations that will need to come up, but there's plenty more there.
So Adam Roach, not really talking about where to dispatch this, but just to make certain it's on your radar. Have you looked at RFC 8599, which does this same sort of thing, but for SIP endpoints?
No, I have not.
Okay, it might be worth looking at that and seeing if there's anything
8599.
you can borrow. Yeah.
Cool.
So Matthew Miller, so again, where exactly this happens, I don't know. One thing to consider though is that often with these, at least my experience with both push services have been, the major push services have been, there needs to be an existing relationship, not just between the application and the device it's on, but the service that's providing it and that push service. Like there's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
That really needs to be part of this consideration. I know that's going to vastly complicate this, but there's not much of a point of continuing unless there is that some way of standardizing that shared relationship, if at all.
Yeah, there certainly needs to be some way to deal with the abuse considerations, which is why everyone requires the registration. But we want to wind up in a situation where you can take arbitrary third-party client A against arbitrary server B, and they don't have to have a pre-existing end-to-end relationship in order to have any push at all.
Sure. And I mean, a lot of what I've seen has been the concern about, about spam, not just from a client receiving too much, but a service receiving too many bogus requests.
Yeah.
And that's where the cool app or my calendaring service would have to have a relationship with Google and Apple in order to push those things.
I expect on this picture here that your cool client would have, cool calendar client would have the user device registration against the cloud service. So it would be registered with, if it's an Android app, it would be registered with Google, and it would have its application ID, and each instance of it would have a user ID that was registered with Google that said pushes for my device, use this key to here. Then there needs to be some way to register with arbitrary CalDAV server, or arbitrary CardDAV server, sorry. Here is how you push via Google to me. Here's the channel that you get updates to me, and here's the updates that I want. And then the server can push those updates down that channel somehow. That's the bit that needs to be standardized.
Sure. My concern is, I guess, reiterating one earlier, I mean, are we going to be able to do that with these providers?
Yeah.
Chris, when I was going to make a similar comment, I think I'm more familiar with Apple than Google's notification service, but I think they've made that extremely restrictive now where, you can't even share, because we operate a service on my team that does some of these similar things. We've had to go around hoops even just to pass notifications from different applications through the same channel. So
if you were to draw this,
I think this is more of a terms of service issue than a protocol issue.
If you were to draw a 4-party version of this where you have 2 things in the cloud, one of which is Cool Calendar Services endpoint that you push to that their device is registered against, and then it has its via Apple or via Google channel kind of embedded between its cloud endpoint and its device. And so you tell the CalDAV server to push to Cool Calendar Services cloud endpoint, that then whatever path it follows gets through to the device to tell the device, here's the change.
Right, but I think the security of everybody in the chain has to be owned by, by a single set of certificates and things like that.
This is Neil Jenkins again. Yeah, the way you make this work for now is that the app on the phone or wherever has to also have its own server component, and that's what the service provider actually talks to. And then that server component obviously is registered the same way as the client is with the push service it wants to use, and has all the certificates it needs to actually get the push to the user's device. Potentially in the future, Apple or Google may support RFC 8030 on its own, so you don't need something in between. But in the meantime, that's how you would make it work. It's still a useful thing of having a standard way for the device to register that it wants to receive these on its server from the service provider that actually has the data. Push.
Yeah. So registering a webhook type of thing. All right. So I guess next step, Alexi, is to talk to you once you've had a chance to think about whether Extra is the right home for this area of work, or to bring it for a BOF or something else later. This is not actually my work. It's work that I see out there in the world happening in a couple of different places that I think should be coming to the IETF.
This is Ben Campbell from the chair. As far as these work from other places that need to come to the IETF, do you think these people are people that would participate in the process in the IETF?
Yes, I do.
And then I'll go further to say the conversations get a little bit dispatchy here, but I don't think that's a problem. But I think one of the big things to find here, since there's several different pieces of work going on, is who's interested in working on this sort of thing, and how can these work efforts be combined or at least coordinated, and that'd be a good discussion to have. What are your next steps on that discussion? Not counting just where Alexi talking about where it would stay, or are you thinking about side meetings or phone calls or anything like that?
Go back to the authors of those 2 that we already have, and obviously look at 8599, which I wasn't aware of, and see whether there's work from that we should be taking. All right, so just as a rough idea in the room, who would be interested in working on this if we brought it to the IETF somewhere? Neil, put your hand up.
So,
great.
Chair to see 1. 2.
Cool.
So keep that in mind. You may need to do some outreach before we can do anything really useful.
Yep. All right, thank you.
And then Justin.
Yep. HTTP request signing, Justin.
All right, so most of this conversation is going to be happening at SecDispatch tomorrow afternoon, but because the whole idea of signing an HTTP request message is very much right at that border of the SEC area and the ART area, I wanted to get people in this room's attention. So the TLDR version is that people want to sign HTTP request messages. Whether or not you agree with that as a goal, people are doing it for lots of different reasons. A lot of these reasons conflict with each other. And so, it's very hard. TLS doesn't solve everything. Nobody's ever heard of SHTTP. I bring that up because somebody actually brought that up on the list. Jose doesn't solve everything, but the important thing here for this group is that people are actually doing this out in the wild. There are at least 5 major versions of this. I invented at least 2 of these myself, and I've implemented almost all of these as well. And they all solve different bits and pieces of the problem. The thing is, even as an implementer and as a draft editor, I don't know if there is a universal solution or if there should be a universal solution. But the fact that people are building these things and using them today for lots of different but related use cases is telling me that it's really starting to get to the time where we need to look at this as a holistic solution space and figure out where these things are going. So I'm going to be talking more about that at Sec Dispatch. Hopefully this stuff can actually find a home, whether that's a new working group in Sec area or in here, I don't know. Whether it finds an existing working group, HTTP auth probably would have been a good place for this at one point in the past, but that chart? Yeah. So basically, I don't know where this needs to land, but I'm getting a stronger and stronger feeling that this does need to land somewhere at some point, hopefully in the near future. So, any thoughts or questions? And like I said, we're gonna have a chance to get into deeper discussion on this during Sec Dispatch, but I do want to respect people's time here and let you guys know this exists. Yes.
How does this relate to the Webpack stuff? I mean, I get there all.
All right. Yes. Thank you. So,
Colin Jennings.
Okay. Somebody wants to answer that for me? That'd be awesome.
Ted Hardy. They are completely and utterly distinct.
Yes.
And so there was a discussion at some point earlier on the WPAC list about whether they ought to be yoked together, and the rending of teeth and gnashing of clothes, or strike that, reverse it, was quite high. This is already difficult enough, and the set of systems you might want for responses and for requests are sufficiently distinct that shoving them all into one thing is too much, and that seems to be the upshot so far.
Right. Yeah. And I also want to add to the fact that there are a couple of places where they should at least talk to each other, and that's that we've got 2 different drafts that define the HTTP signature header, one on request, one on response, and they're completely different from each other. That's a bad thing, by the way. Okay,
Mike Jones, Microsoft. Maybe I wasn't listening well, or maybe you were talking too fast, or maybe both. You said this needs to land somewhere. You have a set of thises, which are 5.
Right.
What is the this that you want to land, and why?
I'm not sure yet. So, so I think maybe there's a grand unified HTTP signing thing that needs to exist. I don't know. So Cabbage signature draft is probably the most implemented one out there, but that also has some pretty severe limitations in what it can express and what it can do. So whether we start there and build on the stuff that Depop adds, I don't actually know. So that's the reason that this is at Dispatch and at Sec Dispatch, because right now there's more questions than reasonable directions. And I hope we can move past that or get through that.
Let me second your point in general that these groups need to talk to each other, including to OAuth. I know that the Cabbage draft, the last time I looked at it, used the authorization header, which OAuth wants to use, making them mutually incompatible.
Yes, so it turns out that at least recent versions of the draft you've got more choices than you know what to do with. You can use the auth header, you can use the signature header, which they invented and also conflicts with the Askin response draft. So yeah, it's a mess.
Mark Nottingham. So just to give some flavor, I know the discussion's over in Sec Dispatch. We've had this on kind of the radar in the HTTP working group for at least a couple of years. We have draft cabbage on our list of documents to watch.
Okay.
And I think we haven't moved on it yet because of the issues you've raised of there's a lot out there. It's not really clear what the right solution is here. My high order bit concerns with moving forward were, Webpack is out there. I had a chat with Jeffrey, and he confirmed that while that was kind of on their radar earlier, it's definitely off the radar now, which is good. And they're even looking at, do they need to have a header at all, which kind of solves the header name
at least that
conflict, which
conflict,
was
yeah.
always kind of lurking out there because that could be unpleasant to deconflict.
Right.
And so I'd encourage you to, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more. What day is it?
It is Monday now. Sec dispatch is tomorrow afternoon, Tuesday
Tomorrow
afternoon.
afternoon. I'm sure we'll talk about it then. That
Right.
At the least, we need to involve the HTTP implementer community in this.
Absolutely.
I've always personally considered this to be in scope for HTTP working group, so consider that one of the places you might want to land up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a very fine place for this to end up. I don't care where it lands, but
yeah,
I think now's the time for it to land.
And that's real. I think that's the interesting information here is that we've been putting it off for so long because getting engagement with the disparate communities has been hard, and there's been a lot of churn.
Yeah.
And if we can get some consolidation where we can, okay, let's go in this direction and solve this percentage of the use cases, it's maybe it's worth trying. So
absolutely. And
stop.
for context, the cabbage draft that several of us have referenced goes back to 2013.
It's been around for a long time.
And it's been an ID without a working group, without any real engagement in the IETF since that time.
Yeah.
So
great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Carsten Bormann, we recently have gone through exactly this kind of exercise, not for HTTP, but for CoAP.
Yes, I'm familiar with the OSCore work, and so CoAP has some aspects to it that make it a much easier and solvable solution space that HTTP does not share.
Still, I just want to mention that the art part of the problem really was understanding, well, what is a request in the first place? So how much context do you actually have to gather before you can design that, before you can authenticate it? What is the freshness concept you're using, and so on? So there's lots of things going on that are really application related and related to the protocol that you're trying to support.
Right, and some of these drafts address that by having that be a specific extension point, but not all of them do. And that's one of the things that I think needs to kind of come together, because some groups, like cabbage drafts, for example, basically say, like, you're doing this all the time, and others don't. So, yeah. John?
John Bradley, Ubico. I'm perhaps to blame for one of the options, or partially to blame for it. The observation is that signing is easy, HTTP is hard.
Yeah.
So my inclination is to actually, and we keep, basically for Depop, we stole part of your draft and simplified it down to remove all of the things that were sort of intractable problems with HTTP. Which
all the stuff that made it useful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I noticed.
But again, it's not useful if people can't do it. So that's the sort of
no, I know. Yeah.
Fine that we wind up in is, do you add enough features so that it's useful for the use case but not deployable, or do you restrict it to be deployable but not necessarily useful? I think we need to work with the HTTP working group, would be my point. That if we're going to actually make real progress, that's probably the right place to do this, because the crypto part is the easy part. It's figuring out how to manage the HTTP, and perhaps and deprecating HTTP and doing something sensible might also be a way to approach the problem.
I want to take that last bit probably off the table for right now, and just to be cognizant of time constraints and stuff like that. For a bit of context that I breezed through, we are specifically looking at detached style signature systems here and not encapsulated signature systems here. So we actually want to use HTTP as HTTP without copying all the stuff into some sub-object and without hiding all of that stuff. In other words, we don't want SOAP with squiggly braces. So that's that. Please come to Sec Dispatch. I'm sure it's going to be a rocking good time.
So
All right,
we
thank you.
encourage everyone who commented here, go make those same comments at Sec Dispatch. I think, though, if the minutes can capture at least this discussion suggested that the art-related issues, and this may be some of the harder ones, and that HTTP biz might be a good place for it to be worked on, but this is all subject to further discussion that's going to happen in Sec Dispatch. And so that's everything that we have on the schedule. We're now to the any other business section. So do we have any other business? Going once, going twice.
There will be I will have a RIP side meeting Thursday at 8:30 in the Sophia room.
Wow, look at that.
Which is this room.
Which is this room. RIP was the name of the draft that I was presenting earlier. I don't know what it stands for.
Look at that dispatch work. We have dispatched to a side meeting that's already been scheduled. I want to thank everyone for their consideration today, and also remind you that dispatch is not just an IETF week phenomenon. So if we read the mailing list and participate on the mailing list and bring your work there, it's even plausible to dispatch things between meetings, which I think is a really exciting possibility. So keep that in mind. Is there anything else?
I was going to say, not only plausible, it is encouraged.
And with that, I believe we're adjourned. I need someone at the register. So I'll take these.